Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. During 2021, the State Historical Society is commemorating the 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood, and the Iowa History 101 webinars will continue throughout the year. In March, which is Iowa History Month, the webinar series will expand to every Tuesday and Thursday. You can learn more about the series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today we will learn more about immigration as we journey through Iowa's Black history to understand the reasons why people or families moved to Iowa, around Iowa, left Iowa, returned, and left again from the beginning of statehood. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are now available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Ricki King. Ricki is a professional genealogist focused on the Midwest and is the owner of Roots to Branches Genealogy, which she started in 2018 after retiring from John Deere Financial. In 2016, Ricki began requesting the state legislature to change the law regarding the ability to access death certificates and fetal death records. Because of her follow-through, the law was changed in 2018 to open fetal death records and death certificates to the public after 50 years, where before there was no date allowing them to be opened. You can learn more about Ricki's work and her company at rootstobranches.com. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Ricki to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Matt, and everyone for attending the presentation. I know Jennifer just gave you my bio, however, I really like this picture of myself. I am standing at my favorite place, the State Historical Building on Grand in Des Moines. And moving on to our next slide, I'll be illustrating the story of Iowa's Black migration into, around, and out of, and back again. I will be using stories of family and others to illustrate my points. Some background to begin with. Iowa's first census was taken in 1836, and the population of Blacks was 3. However, they were not actually reported in the numbers. It was like a side margin on the census. When the first census was taken in 1836, Iowa was a Wisconsin territory, and Iowa Territory started in 1838, and that's where we get the name Iowa, well, from the Native Americans, when we became the state of Iowa in December the 28th, 1846. Throughout the presentation, I will be showing maps I created, marking where Iowa's Black population lived. The maps are using state and federal census statistics. The yellow highlighted areas show the Black population with the numbers representing how many Blacks are living in that county. Now let's see a map. This is showing 1840, 6 years before Iowa became a state and 4 years after Iowa became a state. And the population was 188 and then 333. In Dubuque, here, they had the highest number of Blacks at 72 in 1840, and Muscatine was second at 25. In 1850, Muscatine was first at 69, and Lee County is second with 52 Black persons. Marion is third. This is Marion County. It was not even a state in 1840. Dubuque went from first to fourth place in 10 years. Let me turn on my highlighter, laser pointer here so you can see this a little better. This is Dubuque County, Muscatine County, and Lee County. And this is where Marion County is. And I'm going to move back a little bit to 1839, sorry about that. And this is a photograph of Rachel Bundy's headstone from Find a Grave. Rachel was brought to Iowa Territory as a slave in 1839 by her owner, Thomas Easton. After finding out she was in a free territory, Rachel sought her freedom in Burlington. In May 1839, Rachel's case came before Judge Charles Mason. You may not have heard of Rachel because her case was dropped before a ruling was issued. Rachel's case was 2 months before that of the well-known Ralph Montgomery case, and well-known in Iowa. I will talk more about him in a few moments. And I wanted to show you, this is the actual bill of sale that Rachel's owner, Thomas Easton, presented when he filed the case that he was her owner. And here you will see the mark that Rachel made showing that she did testify. And it was very seldom that Blacks were allowed to testify in court cases at this time. So it's very unique to see her actually making her mark on a court case. And I received this from a Barry Jorgensen, who has seen the original copies. I was unable to see them because of what's going on right now. And let's move on to the court case of Ralph. And I'll give you a little background for those who do not know about Ralph. Ralph came to Iowa before Rachel in 1834. He was a slave who came to work in the lead mines in Dubuque County, drawing about $450 to $550 to buy his freedom. When he was unable to buy his freedom after 5 years, his owners sent slave catchers to return him to Missouri. Ralph sued for his freedom, and a case like that of Rachel's came before Judge Charles Mason. This time the case did go to court. Ralph's case was the first heard by the Iowa Supreme Court. On the left is the court decision. Here, let me zoom in here for you. Oh, my cursor won't let me zoom up. But right here, I'm going to read an excerpt of the words that Judge Mason wrote on the court decision. It says, appearing to the satisfaction of the court on argument of counsel that the said Ralph, a man of color, is free by operation of law. It is therefore ordered and adjudged that he be discharged from further duress and restraint. End quote. Those words gave Ralph his freedom on July the 4th, 1839. The letter can be found at the State Historical Society on their website. On the right here is a picture I took, and it's a memorial called Shattering Silence by James L. Wagner, and he is outside the Iowa Supreme Court building in Des Moines. It was installed in 2009 on the 170th anniversary of the court decision giving Ralph his freedom. The courts did not decide everyone's freedom, though. Uncle Benjamin and Catherine Sandridge, known as Uncle Ben and Aunt Kitty, bought their freedom. From what I found, the couple were brought to Iowa with the intention of them buying their freedom. It is uncertain, though, if they came with their owner or if they were sold to someone who was coming to Iowa. Either way, they knew or believed freedom was close at hand. What we do know about Uncle Ben and Aunt Kitty can be found on their headstones and from the 1887 newspaper recollection of Dr. Johnson, who purported to be their reverend. The photographs are from findagrave.com. When Ben died, Kitty purchased his headstone. Having no known children, Kitty went without a headstone for 24 years after her death. When Dr. Johnson was visiting Burlington, he found out Kitty had no headstone and took up a collection at the church they attended to buy her one. As you can see, the headstones are very hard to read. Oh, good, let me do it this time. This is Uncle Ben's headstone, or Benjamin, and this is Aunt Kitty, Catherine. You can barely make out her name here. And what I'm going to do, since you can't read the headstone, we were lucky enough that when Dr. Johnson gave his testimony or recollections to the newspaper, they also took down what the headstones actually say. So remember, Ben's headstone was purchased by Aunt Kitty. So we're getting firsthand account of their story. And his headstone reads, in memory of Benjamin Sandridge, commonly known as Uncle Ben, born a slave in Virginia and held in bonds about 49 years, died a free man by the laws of his country and by the grace of his God in Iowa, November the 7th, 1855. Being about 53 years of age, unto him that made us kings and priests unto God by glory and dominion forever. Amen. Kitty's headstone reads, in memory of Catherine Sandridge, commonly known as Aunt Kitty, born a slave, the wife of Uncle Ben, and with him made free by their payment of $1,000 to their master. Both became members of the First Baptist Church of Burlington, Iowa, at its organization in 1849, and were faithfully as such to the end, died September the 10th, 1863, being about 63 years of age. To depart to be with Christ is far better, erected by contributions of friends in 1887. For those of you wondering, it cost the Sandridges $1,000 to buy their freedom in 1850. If they were to buy their freedom today, the equivalent value would be $33,536.15. That's a lot of money and a lot of hard work. We'll jump a little ahead here to 1850. And for those of you who do not know what the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 actually entailed, I'll read you a little bit about that as well. It says the act said the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required that slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. The law allowed citizens helping a runaway slave in a free or slave state to be fined or jailed. And I'm showing you this newspaper clipping here for Slave Dick. It's from 1855. It's a really long article, so I was not able to put it all on the slide for you, so I just took the top part of it. But what it says is, or what it's stating, it's from the, let me start. It was 1855 newspaper clipping from the Burlington Tri-Weekly Hawkeye newspaper. The story is telling you the details of what happened to Slave Dick. It's possible that Slave Dick, I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought here. Slave Dick was taken across Mississippi River with a unnamed doctor by ferry to Illinois. And he's supposed to be a runaway slave. When they got to Illinois, there were slave catchers there from Thomas Rutherford, who claims to be his owner, who returned him back to Burlington to face charges. And Mr. Rutherford was from Missouri. The end of the newspaper account states the trial will be the following Tuesday. However, I'm going to have to leave you with unanswered questions. The front page of this newspaper states the Burlington Tri-Weekly Hawkeye was changing its name the next day. And I have not been able to find any other other mention of Slave Dick in any online newspaper. So I'm anxiously awaiting for the State Historical Research Library to open so I can research this further on microfilm. And some questions I'm wanting to answer is, did Dick go free? Did they actually give him his full name? And who was a doctor that took him across the river? And was he ever charged, like in the Fugitive Slave Act? Unanswered questions that we don't have today, but eventually someday we may. I'm gonna go a little bit further in time. And this actually relates to a petition relating to Iowa's Act Against Slavery. And not all Blacks coming to Iowa were slaves. Some were born free. In the case of Alexander Clark, he was one of the ones coming to Iowa free. You are looking at the petition held at the Iowa State Historical Society. In 1855, Alexander Clark led a group of 33 Blacks from Muscatine, leading Black citizens in Muscatine, in signing a petition to repeal the 1851 Iowa exclusionary law called the Act to Prohibit the Naturalization of Free Negroes in this state. And the act was passed a year after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. Clark and the others wanted Iowa to allow the immigration of former slaves into the state. So this is before the end of slavery, but people who had bought their freedom or some other way had attained their freedom were not being allowed into the state because of this law. An interesting fact is the same Charles Mason who gave Rachel and Ralph their freedom or got them their freedom was on the commission that put together the code that became the exclusionary slave law, or exclusionary law. The law was later repealed, but it is interesting that the judge who got two people out of slavery was now barring people from coming in that were already free. And a side note here I want to point out is Alexander Clark was the person who sued Iowa to get his daughter into Iowa schools so there's no longer segregation. And that happened 86 years before the Brown versus Board of Education. Alexander Jr. was the first Black to go to University of Iowa Law School, and he graduated in 1879. His dad followed him, and he was the second person to graduate from Iowa Law School. I know you can't read the signatures. I'm gonna give you a little closer view of them. Here's all the 33 people. This one is Alexander Clark at the very front of the page, top of the page. And what's curious is this one here is Rebecca, his 6-year-old daughter. She was born free in Iowa in Muscatine in 1849. She had a sign for Mark as well as several other people. This here is Catherine Clark, Alexander's wife. And now we'll move on to what the population was like in 1851 when that exclusionary law was passed. As you recall, the yellow highlighted counties are the ones that have Blacks in them. As you can see, there are no highlighted yellows. There's a lot of zeros, and the zeros represents the counties where the census records still exist. Some have been lost over time. The word states here that the census enumerator, he wrote that the total number of white inhabitants of all ages in Johnson County is what he recorded in the census. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see they're all zeros here. And on the, did all enumerators only count the white population? Does this mean there were no Blacks in any Iowa county? If there were Blacks, were they possibly counted on another page that has been lost over time? Who are we to say? However, I have found some Black person, I have found the same Black person in the same town, in the same county, in some years and not in other years. Now let's look at the census statistics for 3 consecutive years, 1850, 1851, and 1852. Now remember, you can see 1850, there was 333 Blacks. 1851, how do you know? All those Blacks have moved out of the state. 1852, they have come back with even more Blacks coming back with them. A few of the counties that had very little, I should say, the larger counties that had like Dubuque and Des Moines, their census records were lost, so they're not being reported here. But I do want to show you the difference from 1850 to 1852 in the numbers, to point out the fact that there were most likely Blacks here in 1851 that just weren't counted. Marion County, which is here, had 29 Blacks in 1850 and 33 in 1852. Jackson County, and these are the counties that the census records still existed in 1851. Oops, I did the wrong one. Sorry about that. Let's go with Johnson County. I picked the wrong county there. Johnson County, where the enumerator stated there were no Blacks in 1852. There were 22 Blacks in 1850 and 20 in 1852. I'm sorry, I can go back. I didn't mess up. Marion, there was 29 Blacks in 1850 and 33 in 1833. Jackson County, I forgot where it was at. Oh, Jackson County had 9 in 1850, none in 1851, and 8 in 1852. Iowa County had one Black in 1850, and they still had one Black in 1852. So you can kind of see they probably the Blacks weren't recorded on the census that were remaining. But we also got to think about people, this in general, people are missed on census years. So it might not have been on purpose. It might have been part of the instructions they were given not to count the Blacks. We never will know. So we can only go off of what we can currently see. Let's jump ahead to 1860. And it's another map. And why do we see two numbers here? In some counties, the top number is the total Blacks reported. The bottom number is the total free Blacks reported. That makes the total number of Blacks and the total number of free Blacks should be the same, wouldn't you think? But we don't know. It's the slavery. There were 11 counties reporting two numbers. Dubuque and Woodbury counties had the biggest difference in numbers, followed by Wapello County with 9, a difference of 9, and Muscatine with a difference of 7. Most counties had a 1 to 4 number difference in their numbers. The total number of Blacks was 1,134 with 1,023 free Blacks. The numbers were off by 111. Some counties reported, again, 0 under total number of Blacks. Let me show you one here. Like Sioux County, their total number, they showed 0, and they showed 1 for free Blacks. Other counties showed 0 free Blacks, like Jones County here, and 7, oops, that's the same one. Delaware County showed 1 free Black and 1 0. So that's why I was saying it's odd that those numbers, if there's 1, it should be 1, because if they're free and they're Black, that counts as one person. Those numbers should be the same. The difference could be because of slave, one could be a slave. Iowa was a free territory, so we do not have slave schedules. And this is how they got around that by reporting. The number that was used, if the number, say, here in Marion County, where there's 34 and 33, when they did record the number of Blacks for the state, they took the higher number is the one that was used. So it really didn't matter. They didn't need 2 numbers. And when I'm looking at the statistics, it is broken down with 2 sets of numbers for 1860. Let's move ahead to 1865. The 1860 was before the war. This is shortly at the end of the war, or just before the war ended, Civil War, I should say. And Lee County was the first county to reach over 1,000 Blacks. It took 20 years for another county to reach that 1,000, and it was Muscatine and Polk, and they both reached it the same year. From 1860 to 1865, the total Blacks population increased by 2,475 in 5 years. Most likely the increase in numbers is from former slaves leaving the South looking for work. A side note here, I wonder what was happening in Iowa County here. There are Blacks surrounding this whole county. What was going on there that there's not at least one Black in that county? I don't know. But 2 years later, in 1867, there would be 9 Blacks living there, and they would reach the height of Blacks as 18 in 1920. I am just curious, I thought I'd point that out to you. Let's jump to about 1870-ish. And this is, I want to relate a story of someone coming to Iowa after the Civil War. And in the history of Grundy County, it is stated Charles Merle followed a Union soldier home named Charles Merle home to Rhinebeck, and he took his name. The townspeople of Rhinebeck, Iowa started calling him Darky Charlie to separate the two men. Charlie was the only Black person in town when he arrived, and he was still the only Black person there when he died in 1923. Charlie never married, and as he aged, the town watched out for him. When he died, they took up a collection to bury him. There is no record of Charlie's original name. And when the town buried him, they took away his adopted name. As you can see, they buried him under the name they called him, making Darky his last name. I discovered Charlie in my research and was able to give him back his adopted name a few years ago. Charlie is buried amongst the townspeople, and the only way you know he is Black is because on his headstone it states he was born in slavery. And I think that was, to me, that seems very respectful that they buried him within their own people and that they took the time to make sure, as his health deteriorated. I was reading a newspaper account where the town was asking how he was doing, and they sent him off to the old senior center, and he would run away and come back home. They take him back, but they always made sure he was okay. And it sounded from he was in the newspapers a lot. You can tell people were taking care of him. So moving on to 1870s map. This is when Charlie first arrived in Iowa. He's found in Black Hawk County, which is the county right next to Grundy County. And he's living with a man by the name of Charles B. Miller in Black Hawk County. Could Miller be the I can't say it, mural referred to in Grundy County's history? And just like I'm having trouble saying the name, maybe other people were hearing the name a slightly different. Mr. Miller was a Civil War soldier, and he fought for Wisconsin. I cannot actually connect them together during the war, but this is the closest I can find. I also could not connect Mr. Miller in coming from Rhinebeck County or having lived in Rhinebeck County. But it's a great story, so I love it. In 1880, it's about the time where the coal mines are starting to recruit Blacks to be strike breakers. And Mahaska County has a population of 524, and that's where the Buxton, Iowa would be, the bigger Black coal mine would be. And White Breast is another coal mine that we'll hear about a little bit. So how did the coal miners in Iowa start recruiting Blacks from other states? Well, they used ads. Munchauconic is a coal mine that predated Buxton, and some of their workers did go over to Buxton. And these ads are all from the Valley Virginian out of Staunton, Virginia. And I want to read you a little bit about some of them. This off to Iowa. It says the Consolidated Coal Company of Iowa wants to employ a number of colored men to work in their mines. Their liberal terms are offered. None but good and reliable men are wanted. It gives instructions on who to contact and when the group will be leaving for Iowa. Hold Iowa here states they will be taking out to the coal mines another lot of 100 colored men. The exodus to Iowa is the White Breast Coal Company. The others here are all from, these two are both from the Buxton Consolidated Coal Company. The exodus of colored people, they want laborers to work in the White Breast coal mines. They will be leaving for Iowa with 150 to 200 males and 30 females, most of whom were from Albemarle County, Virginia. And my family comes from Albemarle County, and maybe they saw this Exodus ad or one like it. I hope they did. But this is my maternal family's first connection to Iowa. And it started with the coal mines from White Breast in 1882 to 1883. On the 1885 census, the first census I find him on, that's an Iowa State Census, Pleasant is listed as living in White Breast as a coal miner. Later, I find him living in Centerville that same year, but now he's working as a pastor. And as a pastor, he never again listed as a coal miner. The Second Baptist Church in Centerville, where he preached, was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1999. So Centerville has a strong Black community, and I like that they actually recognize their community. If you recognize Centerville, that is where Simon Estes is from. Let's look at a full picture of that family. This is the family from the opening slide. As I mentioned, it's my maternal direct line, Joneses. And in this picture, you see Clara Grant Kinney and her husband, Pleasant Jones. These are my two great-grandparents. The boy here in the middle is my great-grandfather, Schuyler Hart Jones. And the boy here is William Shelton Jones. And he was born in Iowa in 1883, the first family member born in Iowa. He would later work as a storekeeper in Buxton. So we've come full circle. They came in from White Breast, the coal mine. Shelton worked in a coal mining town, but not in a coal mine in Buxton. As previously mentioned, the family arrived about 1882, 1883. Let's look at the Black population in 1885. Mahaska County has the most Blacks, going from the 524 in 1880 to the 1,575 in 5 years. Buxton, the Black coal mining town, was most likely why that was increased so fast. Lee County came in second with 1,451, which is 124 less than Mahaska County. If you remember, Lee County was the first county to reach over 1,000 Blacks. 20 years later, when Mahaska County reached 1,000 Blacks, they surpassed Lee County. We're going to jump ahead here to 1917. And this is Blacks didn't always come as coal miners also. They came as military service. And you're looking at a picture from the Iowa Bystander, and it's of the first Black officers training camp at Fort Des Moines. And once these officers went off to war, a lot of them came back to Des Moines or other towns in Iowa. James E. Morris was from Atlanta, and he was one of the soldiers that trained at this camp. I do not know if he's in the picture, but when he came back to Iowa, he bought the Black-owned newspaper, the Iowa Bystander, which this picture is from. I thought that was a good tie in there. It is not the only military service that brought Blacks. It's not only military service that brought Blacks to Iowa. Sometimes they moved for work. In this case, this is my paternal direct family, Edward and Ida. They came to Iowa during the Great Migration in 1920. Instead of going to Detroit or Chicago, they just went the 111 miles to Burlington, where they had family living. They may not have thought of permanently staying in Burlington, because when their 4 children died between 1920 and 1929, they were buried back in New London, Missouri, where they came from. However, Ida and Edward never left Burlington and are buried in never went back to Missouri and are buried in Burlington. And as I said, they came in 1920. We're going to move 5 years ahead to 1925. And this 1925 map is the last Iowa State Census. I went through to get these numbers for all these maps, I went through the federal and state census statistics starting 1836 to 1940. And that was the last available record. 1940 was the last available census record open to the public. The next one's coming up to be open. So that's why I stopped in 1940. There has never been a Black in all 99 counties in Iowa at one time. All counties have had Blacks, but never at the same time in a census year. Here you'll see Plymouth, Allamakee, and Ringgold. As I said, they've had Blacks in it. The earliest Plymouth had a Black in it was in 1856, and Allamakee and Ringgold had Black persons there in 1860. And just as a side note, I want to point out the 1825 census is one of the most important census if you're doing your own family history, because it asks for the woman's maiden name and it asks for their parents. So genealogists around the world want to have family in Iowa because it gets them a whole generation back, sometimes two if the grandparents are living or the parents are living. There's 3 pages, so you want to make sure you look at all 3 pages. The information with the parents' information is on the 2nd page. Now let's move to the last census that's publicly available, the 1940 Federal Census. The counties with the largest population are Polk, which is here at 6,637, Black Hawk County at 1,528, Black Hawk's up here, and Lee County at 1,211. And the total Black population was 16,694. A 2019 survey from the American community reported by the Census Bureau, the total Black population of Iowa was at 4.1%. I don't know what it is today, but we should be finding out soon after last year's census. And look, we're still in 1948, so this is my grandparents, William Heinie and Aldeen Davis. Aldeen is the daughter of that little boy that was in the middle of the picture. And William Heinie, they married in Centerville, where they grew up together. Aldeen is, oops, I already told you that. Heinie occupation was as a masonry. He was so well known in the state that Muscatine asked him if he wanted to help them build their pool around 1948. He said he would only do it if his 4 young daughters were allowed to swim in the pool on any day and at any time. In Centerville, they were only allowed to swim on Saturday, and the pool was drained that night. The family did experience other segregation in town at the movie theater, restaurants, and other places. Heinie's terms were met by Muscatine, and the family made the move to Muscatine. The girls would leave Muscatine as they married. Their daughter Penny would marry a young man, Leon King, from Burlington, the grandson of Edward and Ida King, and become my mother. Penny would later move with her family to Des Moines. In the late 1980s, Penny would move again to Philadelphia to live with her sister-in-law, return to Iowa as her kids had children and wanted to be closer to her grandchildren. In case you're wondering, this is a map of where my ancestors lived around the state, and I'm giving you a full view of the state of Iowa in case people are listening from outside of Iowa and don't know where the counties are and how close they are together. And I'll zoom in a little bit more here. I'm listing the counties as where my family first came in, like White Breast. This is when the first Jones family arrived. And then they moved to Centerville. And then the family moved to Muscatine. And my parents raised us in Burlington. And then my mom moved to Des Moines. And I currently am in Des Moines with my mom and my sisters and brother. I did have a brother that moved to California and that has stayed there. I went out there, did not like it, moved back to Iowa. And I had a brother and sister that did the same thing. So we've moved in and out as well. I do still have cousins in Centerville, and I have a sister and cousins in Burlington. So we've been around for a long time in Iowa. And you want to know how long we've been in Iowa, my family has been? The Jones family has been here 138 years. And this is a pedigree chart from the first people to arrive down to me. And some of you may not know Aldeen Davis. I was showing you in the last picture. She wrote for the column Soul Food for Thought for the Muscatine Journal and taught Black history at the community college during the 70s. And that's where I learned and began to love Black history, because she also taught it to her grandkids. How long has my King family been in Iowa? 101 years. It amazes me how long both sides of my family has lived here. The first arriving 37 years after statehood. As I was putting this presentation together, I happened to be looking at old family photos, and I came across a King family member who moved to Iowa, around Iowa, out of Iowa, and back again. She went by many names. She went by Minnie, or Pat Flood, even Latricia or La Patricia King. Minnie and her mother were the first Kings to migrate to Iowa. Edward and Ida followed them to Burlington. For a short time in 1920, Minnie moved out of state, living in Rock Island, Illinois. I know she didn't move far out of state, but she did leave the state. She lived in Muscatine twice. At one point, Minnie was my mother's upstairs neighbor when she was growing up. That boggles my mind. And there's no direct relation, but Patricia married an Omer King and lived in Centerville. Minnie, or Pat, moved back to Muscatine and spent the rest of her life going by Latricia. I am still trying to determine her real first name. Minnie is a bridge between my Jones and King family, moving in and out of towns where each family member lived at one point. Again, I like my little side stories. Minnie introduced my parents. When she lived above my mother, she took her and her sister on a road trip to Burlington to meet her nephews. The introduction was not memorable because neither one of them remembered it. But many years later, at a house party after a Burlington and Muscatine basketball game, I believe it was a basketball game, they met again at a dance or a party and later married. At the wedding, while greeting guests at the reception, my dad went to introduce my mom to his Aunt Minnie. That is when my mom saw her upstairs neighbor, Pat Flood. She's come full circle. Why do Blacks or any nationality move into or out of Iowa? It may be for employment opportunities, military service, education, following family, cheaper to live in the state, returning to be near family, and last but not least, Iowa is a great place to raise kids. Matt, thank you for attending. And Matt, are there any questions?
Thank you, Ricki. We have some time for answer some questions. However, before I pose the first question, I always want to remind everyone you can still submit your questions to the Q&A feature. As always, we're on a schedule, so we may not be able to reach everyone's question before the end. But here's the first question, and we'll start with a nice little softball one for you. What cemetery are Ben and Catherine Sandridge buried in?
Aspen Grove. That was a soft one, but almost went right on my head. Aspen Grove, the same place where my family is buried.
Next question, you did such great work with census data. So on that note, how do you access and use census data in your research? And then what can be learned from that material?
I recommend, you can get it off ancestry.com, but I recommend using familysearch.org, because it's free and it's the same census information. And sorry, what was the rest of the question again?
Oh, what can be like learned from that, using that data?
It can tell you where your family came from. It can tell you their parents. One good section is if you watch the kids, as we're to ask where they were born at, you see someone was born in Virginia, North Carolina, Illinois, Iowa. You can trace their migration paths by what states their kids are born in. So I always like that. And then you can also look for multi-generations within a family. Sometimes I have a Bill Jones and the next one is Jim Jones. Look to see if there's a connection, because they're closely living together. There's probably going to be a relative there.
And you talked in the beginning about how crossing into Iowa as a free state did not guarantee freedom for those enslaved. Have you found any historical information about their lives?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the talk, it was briefly discussed about how crossing the border into a free state like Iowa did not guarantee those from enslavement. Have you found any historical information about any of those people?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I think I'm not hearing everything you're saying. They've crossed over from a free state, but they did not get their freedom, is what you're saying?
Yes. So just if you found any more information about people who came to Iowa in enslavement and stayed that way in the early territory period.
I do not have names of people, but there is a George Wallace that actually claimed to have 10 slaves in a census. So that's how we know they were never freed. But I have information on runaway slaves that came to Iowa, but none that remained in slavery that I have currently found. And I'm doing a research project now that is following Blacks that were listed on the 1850 census. So I probably will come across more of those as I move on in my research.
Now, talking about research, do you have any favorite primary source you came across while researching?
I like government records, prison records. Even though people don't want to have a criminal in their family, it's the best source of information, because in their intake, they're asking them who their nearest relative is, or nearest contact person, could be a relative. Newspaper stories are my absolute favorite, even though they're not primary. Funeral home records are another good one, because the person who is going to be paying for the funeral or supplying the information is probably going to be a relative. If not, you can at least trace that person to a relative. They could be marrying into the family later, a man taking care of it for a woman he knows.
Now, you did talk about why people were migrating to Iowa in a later period. But have you found any reasons or ideas of why they were coming as Iowa as a territory?
Did I? As a territory. They were brought here. They were brought here as slaves. Since Iowa was not a slave territory, what they did was they had people sign a contract saying they were servants. So that's why they were here early. And that happened with a lady called Patsy Triplett when she was first brought to Iowa. And she came before we were a state.
Perfect. Now, obviously you are a genealogist. So what drew you to be a genealogist?
That Edward and Ida King that I pointed out, I knew nothing about their family. Their daughter wouldn't talk, my grandmother wouldn't talk about her family, so I was just curious to learn more about them. And I actually have a upcoming magazine article from the National Genealogical Society of Quarterly Journal. It's a journal that's coming out in March of this year, actually about that family.
That's fantastic. Actually, with that answer, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. But I think we can all agree this has been a very informative lunch. I say it every time we do a webinar, but I learn a lot. So thank you, Ricki.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to hear these things. Also, thank you to everyone joining us today. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History Month webinars on Tuesdays and Thursdays in March. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in our series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. While you're there, you can look into some of the other fantastic digital programs, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activities, Young Historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again on March 2nd for our first Iowa History Month webinar. Thank you all.